Opposition to God can prosper. But God, not the opposition, God determines how long the opposition lasts, and He determines how it ends. Winning is persuasive. You ever notice when somebody keeps succeeding at something, it's very easy for you to start wondering if they know something that you don't know. And this gets especially difficult when it comes to us trying to follow Jesus with our lives. We believe something because Jesus says it's true, but then people who reject what Jesus says, their lives don't seem to be falling apart. They seem competent. Their ideas are gaining traction and influence. And some of what Jesus teaches is described simply not as outdated or as foolish, but it's described as harmful and perhaps even abusive. And after a while, when we see that happening, people that have rejected what Jesus said, their ideas winning, a question can begin to creep into our own minds. Am I the one who's missing something? What do we do when opposition to God, His truth, His worship, does not seem to be losing? What do we do when actually opposition to God, His truth, His worship, His ways actually seems to be winning? Daniel chapter 8, the vision that Daniel sees here, takes us right into those questions. It feels that tension. Now, we're actually going backwards in the book of Daniel. We've looked a couple of months ago in Daniel chapters 1 through 6. And in Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8, we actually are going backwards. Chapter 7 was at the first year of the reign of Belshazzar. And Belshazzar was described in chapters 5 and 6, the writing on the wall, the destruction of that kingdom. And then in chapter 8, we find a vision that happens 2 years later after the vision in chapter 7. So this is the third year of the reign of Belshazzar. In Daniel chapter 7, we got a sort of a wide-angle view of what's happening with the power of earthly kingdoms on the earth. We saw a sort of wide-angle view where kingdoms are represented like beasts of the earth, but above them, Daniel looks to heaven and sees that heaven's not in chaos, heaven's not in an uproar. Instead, the Ancient of Days, the God of gods, He has seated on His throne, carrying out judgment, and ultimately giving to one like the Son of Man, which we saw was Jesus Christ, glory and dominion and a kingdom that is everlasting. And then in Daniel chapter 8, we get another odd vision. Again, 2 years later, starts out with two different types of beasts. Now it's not lions and leopards with weird-looking bodies, but instead it's a ram and a goat that are doing battle. And in what's happening in Daniel chapter 8 is Daniel's sort of getting a narrowed vision of the camera, if you will. If there was a wide-angle shot in Daniel 7, now that angle is moving in more closely to look to particularly at one ruler who turns his power not to trampling other human kingdoms, but who turns his authority and his power directly against God, God's people, God's temple, God's worship, God's truth. And so that predatory power that was used in Daniel 7 towards other earthly kingdoms, now that power is being turned directly toward the expression of God's worship and truth on the earth. And the disturbing part about the vision, what makes Daniel say at the end of this chapter that he was sick for some days afterwards, is that this opposition to God, His worship, and His truth actually succeeds. It wins. So let's watch together what Daniel sees in this vision. And what we're going to do is look at the vision itself, and then we're going to compare it at the same time to the interpretation that the angel Gabriel provides for Daniel of the vision that he has seen. Now, I want to be clear here. If you notice in verse 27, at the end of it, he says, I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Okay? So if Daniel, with the help of an angel, still had questions, I expect you will after I'm done with this sermon, okay? So let's just set expectations at the right place. But let's look at this vision together. First of all, look at verse 3, where Daniel sees a ram with two horns charging west and north and south. And then in verse 4 it says, no beast could stand before him, right? This beast, this ram, does what he pleases. He becomes a great ruler and his kingdom becomes great. And Gabriel tells Daniel in verse 20 that the ram represents Media and Persia, those kingdoms together. And from Daniel's perspective, that empire is still in the future. Now later, Daniel would rule under that empire when he's thrown into the lion's den. The Persian Empire has defeated the Babylonian Empire, which is who he's currently serving here in Daniel chapter 8. But this vision, Daniel's perspective, this empire, this ram that's coming is still in the future. But the vision looks unstoppable. This ram goes wherever he wants, east, west, north, and nothing can stop him, right? And then in the vision, a male goat comes from the west so quickly that it doesn't even seem to touch the ground. And that goat attacks the ram, breaks its horns, which is its ruler, and tramples it. In verse 21, Gabriel tells us that the goat is Greece. And the great horn on this goat is its first king, which we know is Alexander the Great. Then notice in verse 8, the goat becomes exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn, the great ruler, was broken. Now notice that this great ruler was not broken after he had sort of slowly faded away. It was at the apex of his power, of his strength. When he was strong, the great horn was broken. And the vision tells us that 4 horns rise up in his place, representing the 4 kingdoms that emerged after Alexander the Great's death at a very young age at the height of his power. So Daniel watches power here in this vision keep changing hands. Earthly power rises, and then it falls, and it changes hands. Persia becomes great, the ram, and then Greece comes and becomes even greater. And then Alexander, the great horn of the Greek kingdom, seems untouchable. And then suddenly he's gone. So the powers that dominate the present can look permanent while we're living under them. But then the vision narrows, moves from the ram and the goat, and it focuses upon one particular ruler that rises from this goat. One who will do more than just conquer another kingdom. Notice there in verse 9, as this earthly power turns against God and prospers. Notice there in verse 9, something changes. Out of one of those Greek kingdoms, those 4 horns that arise, Daniel calls a little horn arises. And Gabriel tells us in verse 23 that a fierce king will arise, and we know him from history as Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And he ruled the part of the old Greek Empire about 170 years before Jesus came to the earth. So the ram and the goat conquered kingdoms, but Antiochus turns his power against God and what belongs to him. His focus becomes on the worship and on the sacrifices. Notice in verse 10, it pictures him throwing down some of the host of heaven. Not exactly sure what that means, but Gabriel makes the point clear in verse 24 that God's people will be cast down. They will be destroyed. They will be harmed by this little horn. Verse 11 says the little horn exalts himself against the prince of hosts. He stops the regular sacrifices and he desecrates the temple in Jerusalem. Antiochus was not content simply to rule the Jewish people. He tried to stop them from living their lives as God's people, under God's truth, and worshiping God as He had instructed them to do. And I want to just rule you, I want to erase God from your life. That's what He's after. And then in verse 12 it says that the truth was thrown to the ground. So Antiochus here does not prove that Israel God isn't real, right? He doesn't show up and put on an apologetics course to prove, hey, you guys are worshiping a false god. That's foolish. Let's move on. And through intellectual discussion, the change happens. That's not what Antiochus does. Instead, Antiochus has real, physical, brute force, power. And he used it to put an end to the worship of Yahweh, the sacrifices, and tramples the truth of God's law on the ground. Now, we're not living under Antiochus. That's not what we're experiencing. Some Christians in the world do face physical brute force as a means of trying to throw the truth of the gospel to the ground and the worship of God being removed from their lives. But when you arrived to church this morning to gather, nobody was out in the parking lot with an army telling us we could not worship Christ together. But we know that power does not always work through physical force. Sometimes all it takes is realizing that people whose opinion matter to us believe what we think is ridiculous. You say, I actually believe what Jesus says when He says He is the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except by Him. It's a very exclusive claim. And wouldn't be uncommon if we make that statement for someone to respond, you really believe that? That sounds like bigotry. That sounds hateful. That seems pretty narrow. But you'll notice what's happened in their response. Nobody proved that Jesus was wrong when He said He was the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except by Him. No argument was made. They just gave your belief a label. Narrow, bigoted, too exclusive. And sometimes you don't need an army to throw the truth to the ground. All you need is a label. And it's quiet. And that label may come from sincere concern that Christian teaching harms people. But sincere concern still does not show that Jesus was wrong when He made the claim about Himself being the way, the truth, and the life. And here's what happens. If we hear that label enough, especially from people that we want to like us or we want them to view us as reasonable, intellectual, reasonable people, and then all of a sudden something can start to feel unbelievable to us. Not because they made a better argument or gave us better reasons, but because we start to think that sensible people just don't believe things like that anymore. But Christianity says truth is not decided by whoever has the most power, the biggest army, or by whatever makes it easiest for us to fit in with our world, our culture. Christianity says if God is real, He really exists, then He is the source of truth, and that truth stands above every culture on the earth today and that has ever existed, including our own culture. Antiochus could throw truth to the ground. He could make faithfulness to the truth costly, but he could not make the truth false. He didn't have that power. He tries. And in verse 12, he tells us something even more troubling. He actually prospers in throwing the truth to the ground. in stopping the worship in the temple for a length of time. So the question becomes, when we see this opposition to the truth prospering, we want to ask, how long can this go on? And that's exactly the question that's asked there in verse 13 of chapter 8. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" How long can this little horn oppress the truth? And the answer in this particular situation comes in verse 14. "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." Now, as with many things in apocalyptic literature, these types of visions in the Bible, there is debate exactly how long these evenings and mornings should be counted. But the main point here is actually not difficult to see. Whether it's 2,300 days or half that many days, the reality is there is a number. This suppression of the truth does not go on forever. That is why Gabriel says in verse 19 that all of this concerns the appointed time of the end. Antiochus can stop the sacrifices. He can desecrate the temple. He can throw the truth to the ground. But he does not control the clock of how long that will last. The sanctuary, we learn, will be restored. And of course, in history, it was. This is what the Jewish people celebrate when they celebrate Hanukkah. And in verse 25, it tells us what will happen to the king himself, who has risen up against even the prince of hosts, the prince of princes. Scripture tells us in this vision that this little horn who oppresses and throws the truth to the ground, he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The man who has been throwing others down will himself be brought down. He will end, and his end will not be on his own terms. So when someone in heaven asks, how long can this happen? It's not, well, hey, it's not going to really be that bad. That's what it was said. It will be bad. And it's not, opposition to God will never see success. Daniel has already shown us that it will. With Antiochus, and I argue that Antiochus is just a prototype of other people throughout history who will oppose themselves to the Son of Man who's received a kingdom and dominion and power, sort of antichrist spirit. Daniel showed us that there can be success in that. The answer to the question of how long is, it will not last forever. And remember, Daniel is hearing all of this before Antiochus even appears in history, 300-400 years ahead of time. God is telling His people through Daniel, through this vision, the ending of their suffering before it happens. So when Antiochus seems to be winning, when he desecrates the temple, when he stops the sacrifices, they will not have to look at what they can see and conclude that God has lost control, because God has already counted the days and told them when it ends. The ruler who can throw the truth to the ground cannot decide how long he gets to keep it there. God does. And that's really the point of this vision. We've seen so far in these movements through this vision that earthly power changes hand. It rises, it falls, but it's never permanent with one individual. And then one ruler rises up specifically against God, His truth, His worship, His people. He attacks His people and His worship, and he throws the truth to the ground, and he prospers in doing this. He's winning. And then heaven asks, how long can this go on? And we learn that that winning has an end date, an appointed time to end. And so that leads us to conclude that opposition to God can and does prosper. We shouldn't be surprised by that. Opposition to God can prosper, but God, not the opposition, God determines how long the opposition lasts, and He determines how it ends. Because He is the true source of power and authority in the world. He's permanent. So with that truth, that opposition to God can prosper, but God determines how long it lasts and how it ends, what is this vision that Daniel gets here in chapter 8 calling us to do? I think it's this. Stay loyal to Jesus when compromise looks more reasonable than faithfulness. Stay loyal to Jesus when compromise looks more reasonable than faithfulness. You see, Antiochus is trying to make allegiance to God disappear. He doesn't just want to rule the Jewish people. He wants them to stop worshiping Yahweh. And for a season, he gets his wish. He desecrates the temple. He prohibits the sacrifices from being carried out in the temple as God had instructed the nation of Israel to do. But as I mentioned earlier, we're not living under Antiochus. But we do live in a world that has its own ideas about which parts of Christianity are reasonable and which parts ought to be rejected and left behind by enlightened and sensible people. And usually, none of those people outside of the Christian faith ask Christians to reject Jesus altogether. Matter of fact, there's certain things about Jesus that are welcome, right? A Jesus who loves people, a Jesus who forgives people, a Jesus who helps us through suffering. Well, He's very little trouble, and He's welcome. The pressure comes when Jesus says something that our world does not want Him to say. He says He's the only way to the Father. He tells us that some of the desires we have shouldn't be followed or acted upon because they dishonor Him and are harmful to us. He says our deepest problem is not caused by our environment, but the sin in our heart, which is rebellion against Him. And probably the most frustrating thing is that Jesus claims the right to tell all of us on the planet what is true. And He calls us to believe it. That's the truth that has to be stopped. That's the truth that has to be opposed, thrown to the ground. And so because that happens, we as Christians face a question. Who gets to decide which parts of Jesus we keep? Right? Because there's a subtle way for us to respond to this pressure we can feel when we believe all that Jesus calls us to believe. And typically that pressure is not for us to stop calling ourselves a Christian. Right? It's simply to begin holding certain things Jesus says more loosely, right? Because everyone around us seems certain that Jesus can't possibly be right about that issue in our time and place. And so the truth gets stamped out. It gets silenced both by individual Christians, and you'll never hear those things talked about in churches, even churches that claim to believe the Bible and preach the gospel. And after a while, if we don't recognize that pressure and push back, you can end up with a Jesus who never disagrees with the world that you're living in. The culture, the world, and what Jesus says and does, man, they're the same thing. Isn't it so easy to be a Christian? But when that happens, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of Lord agrees with everything the world says? If Jesus only gets to speak where we have already decided He's right, then Jesus is not actually the one in authority. We are. And there's something attractive to that. That's why it's so popular. Why there's so many preachers that will offer that kind of Jesus to people who are gathered for worship this morning in all kinds of buildings and places around the world. We want Jesus. We like His love and His forgiveness and His help through suffering. He's a great sidekick to take through life. We want Him here, but we want some control over how our relationship works. We want to be able to say to Jesus, I will follow you here because that seems reasonable and sensible. I get that. I'll follow you here, but surely you do not expect me to do that. Follow you in that way or believe that truth. But then when we do that, we're taking what already feels reasonable to us, sensible to us, and we're placing it above Jesus. And taking the truth He's given to us and we're throwing it to the ground. And then that raises another question. If Jesus gets to decide what we keep or not keep about what He says, and not us, or not other people in the world, why does Jesus have the right to do that? Why does Jesus and not our culture, why does Jesus and not what we think is reasonable, why does He get the right to correct what's right and true, right and wrong? Well, the answer to that's not just because, well, everybody needs some religious authority in their life. That's not the case. Christianity calls you to actually look at Jesus for the answer to that question. Why does Jesus get to correct me? Why does He get to tell me what's true and what's wrong? If you look at the end of Jesus' life here on earth, Jesus stands before Pilate, who was a representative of the Roman Empire, of Caesar. Not Antiochus, but in the same family tree. And Pilate appears to control what will happen next to Jesus. Jesus says to Pilate that He came into the world to bear witness to the truth. And Pilate famously responds, "What is truth?" But oddly enough, Pilate himself is under pressure too. He already knows what's true about Jesus. He's not guilty of what the people who want to kill Him say He's guilty of. He knows what's true about Jesus. But the voices around Him, the political pressure of those around are saying, hey, Pilate, you want favor with Caesar. You want favor with us. You don't want to cause a riot and lose your position. Let's be reasonable. Why don't you believe about Jesus what we're saying about Jesus? He's found no guilt, but the voices around Him want another verdict on who Jesus is. So you can see the pressure building for Pilate. And then Pilate reminds Jesus that he has the authority to release Him or to crucify Him. Don't you know who I am? Jesus of Nazareth. I'm Pilate. I've got power. I've got authority. And Jesus tells him, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Pilate's power is real. Antiochus' power is real. Those who oppose Christ and His truth and His worship today, their power is real, but it's not final. Their authority comes from above, from the Ancient of Days. And so under pressure, Pilate eventually uses his authority to protect himself rather than to do what he knows is right. And Jesus compares this because He's very different from Pilate. Jesus does not give way. He doesn't back down. He gives Himself for sinners like us, including all the ways that we have resisted God's authority, all the ways that we in our own life have taken the truth He's revealed and we've thrown it to the ground, that we've suppressed the worship that we owed Him with our lives. He dies for us. The cross shows us what kind of Lord has the right to correct us. The Lord who has the right to correct us is the one who dies for us. The King who is asking us to surrender control is the King who gave Himself to save us by His death on the cross and His resurrection from the dead. This is why, as Christians, we call Jesus Lord. Why does He have the right to correct us? Not because everything He says fits comfortably with what our culture is already believing and telling us is true and right. He gets to tell us what's right and true because He is the crucified, resurrected, and reigning King. And if that's true, if Jesus has been crucified and raised from the dead, and He has received a kingdom and dominion and power from the Ancient of Days, the question is not, does everything Jesus say to me make sense to me? The question is Jesus who He claims to be? That's the real question. Because if He is who He claims to be, the way, the truth, the life, then what He says is true, even if it doesn't make sense to us. If He is those things, then it makes sense. We should expect Him to correct us, to rule over us, to redirect us in our life. There will be places where Jesus tells the world around me, you're wrong about how you're thinking about this. You're wrong in how you're living your life. And there will be places where Jesus has to say that to me as well. So when something Jesus says gets thrown to the ground, who gets to decide whether it stays there or whether it should be picked up? Daniel shows us that opposition to God can prosper. But his vision also tells us that it doesn't get to decide what is true. And it doesn't get to decide how the story ends. And because Jesus was crucified, was raised from the dead, and now reigns in heaven, we do not have to fear or despise those who disagree with us in order to remain loyal to Him. So I want to encourage you to not let the world that is temporary edit the words of a king who is not temporary. His kingdom is everlasting. Stay loyal to Jesus when compromise looks more reasonable than faithfulness. It's an important truth to have in your mind, in your heart. Because there will be moments when it looks like truth is losing. And what Jesus says and teaches may be called harmful or even abusive. The voices opposing Him may sound more confident and for a while appear to be more successful. And when that happens, that winning can be persuasive, making us think, maybe I'm on the wrong side. Maybe believing what Jesus says isn't worth it. But in Daniel chapter 8, we are taken behind the curtain, and what looks like winning is not the same thing as having the last word. Antiochus looked like a ruler with no limits, but he was never off God's leash. And neither is anything that sets itself against Jesus and His truth today. That doesn't mean that oppression and opposition to the truth of Christ is harmless. Daniel himself saw how much damage would be done in his vision. It made him sick to his stomach. And it doesn't mean that opposition will never have its day. It just means that it's not ultimate. It doesn't control how long it lasts or how it ends. Jesus alone has that power. The King who was rejected, who was crucified, is now risen from the dead, and He is now reigning over an everlasting kingdom. So when our loyalty to Him and His truth and His worship looks unreasonable, we have to remember what is happening behind the curtain. What opposes Jesus today may look unleashed, but it never is. It's under His control, under His power, and He knows its end. Let's pray.